Good afternoon and welcome back. I don't know how well this is going to record, so my apologies in advance. I'm going to piece this together out of several steps because I have no one to hold the camera while I do the actual work. So what I hope to do is show you what I have done or where I'm starting from, and then step by step as I do each process show you the before and after. So for now, what I've got here is an Atari 1200XL motherboard, and I'm going to eventually in a few weeks probably get a second Ultimate 1 megabyte to put into this machine. I only have one currently, and it lives in my usual daily driver machine, which is an 800XL. To install one in a 1200XL is a little more difficult. You have to do a couple of things, mostly because of the way Atari split the OS ROMs up on this machine into two different sockets. As you can see here, we have an upper and a lower socket, and neither of those of course has BASIC. This machine does not have BASIC built in. It's the only XL machine that does not. So this kind of mod I'm going to do now is to convert this motherboard setup to one that uses one 28-pin ROM rather than two 26-pin ROMs for the OS, as the current default machine is set up to do. And to do that requires swapping around those white jumpers on the board. As you can see, there's a bank of 3 of them up here at the top, and then one rather important one, W6, down here at the lower OS ROM. Those need to be reconfigured so that this machine can access all of its ROM in one chip rather than two. I also need to swap out this component right here, which is the memory management unit. The one on the 1200XL cannot do what the one on the 800XL and 600XL can do. So I'm going to swap that in with the standard XL MMU and a standard Atari 800XL ROM, or any XL machine ROM, in the top socket. But to reconfigure these jumpers, what I've done ahead of time is to straighten these little legs of the jumpers down here that I have to remove and modify. W6 is here, so I've raised up the legs so that it'll be easier to desolder and won't get hung up when I pull it out. And up here on 2 of the jumpers that I have to remove and insert elsewhere, I've done the same thing. Those jumpers are really, they're called 1 ohm resistors, but basically they're just a straight piece of wire with a unique color coding to delineate that they're jumpers rather than ordinary resistors or capacitors. So these 2 up here are coming out and being relocated to the slots immediately below them, and W6 is being removed entirely, and I will then run a jumper wire from one of the pins on the CPU back to that W6 location as part of the single chip OS ROM mod. And lest anyone is curious, this thing up here is one of Atari Age user Brian's UAV video mod boards, which I have installed in this machine. It basically replaces the stock video circuit and provides a very, very good quality S-video chroma luma signal, as well as a very sharp composite signal. So that's what that is, and that was done actually now a couple months ago when I restored this machine. This is actually the same machine in my other 2 videos where I had to replace sockets, so to get it to boot. So anyway, this is the first step in the process. And welcome back. So what I've done here is I have used my cheapest dirt $15 desoldering pump, which is basically a fixed 30-watt iron that you have to be really careful with because it gets really hot really fast and can damage the board. But the good thing about it is it's cheap, and it's got this pump built in. So what you do is you put it down over the leg of a component you want to remove, along with a drop or two of liquid flux. Let it heat up for a couple seconds, press the plunger, and bam, hole gets cleaned out. So I use this thing to see if I can find this now in the camera view. Apologies. I use this to and here is W6. I've used it to clear out the vias, mostly around the legs of the W6 component, which I will remove from the top of the board. And up here, I've done the same thing for the legs of the other jumpers that have to be relocated, as well as cleaning out the holes that they will be relocated to. Of course, I'll clean all this up with alcohol at some point before I put the machine back together and remove any of the flux residue and so forth. But as you can see, I didn't lift any pads, and once I clean out the residual solder muck and move the components and get them all soldered back into place, it should look not quite factory, but very close. The downside of using a cheap tool like this is it doesn't have temperature control. So like I said, you plug it in and it just gets hot, and it'll just keep on getting hotter and hotter and hotter until it reaches equilibrium temperature, which will probably be about 150, 200 degrees too hot for the rest of the board, which means that as you use it for more than a little while, it will start to damage the traces. It'll lift the traces, it'll remove the via pads right off the board, and eventually will actually burn the resins that were used to make the PCB. So it's nice to have a cheap tool that works, but you have to be really careful with it and pay a lot of attention to how hot it's getting. And you can kind of judge that by how fast the solder is bubbling, and especially if you use liquid flux, which really helps. You can see how fast the flux bubbles and how fast it bubbles away completely. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can cool it down a little bit by dampening it with a wet sponge, which I have here with my Hacko station, which will help keep it in a usable temperature. But again, you're just kind of eyeballing it here because it has no temperature scale. So the other thing you can do is simply unplug it and plug it back in when you need it again. So fortunately for me, I think until I clean out the vias where I will install the jumpers to mount my Ultimate 1 Megabyte eventually, which will be at some point down the road, I'm done with this tool, so I will unplug it and call it good for now. Now I have to just find a good place to set it down where it won't set anything on fire while it's hot. So, good times with cheap tools. And okay, now here we can see that I have removed the jumpers at W7 and 8 and mostly cleaned out the vias at 12 and 11, where I will be relocating those jumpers. And the jumper at W6 has been removed as well. They all came out fairly good condition. I'll straighten out the legs and clean them off before I repurpose them. Well, repurpose two of them, and I will then run the jumper wire from the CPU under the board to the top pad of W6 as part of this mod. And I'm back again. This took longer than expected, mostly because of something that I'm going to talk about for just a second. This cheap, generally fantastic wire stripper for some reason has decided to start killing my solid core wire. I'll set it to strip off 1/8 of an inch, I'll get 1/8 of an inch, I'll do the other side of the wire, and it'll strip 4 inches and like stretch the plastic or the insulation right off the wire. In fact, it'll grab a hold of the solid core of the wire and sometimes pull the core almost straight through the plastic so that the part I stripped at the other end is no longer even showing. So I ended up having to cut a much longer jumper cable, or jumper wire, than I meant to for the back of the board, and that is just sloppy, but I'm going to come back and fix it at some other point. But just to show you what I've done in the meantime, I have relocated these jumpers. Again, the board isn't terribly clean. I'm going to clean it all up with alcohol and cotton pads afterwards. And I have filled, as you can see, the top pad of W6 now has a little lump in it, and that is the stub of the jumper wire, which again is about 1/3 too long than it should be. But I have soldered it to pin 23 of the CPU, and it runs to the top pad of W6, where the jumper used to be. So all that should be left to do now is to pull these two these two OS ROMs, and pull the MMU right there in the top socket in center of the field of view, and replace those with spares I have from an 800XL. And once I do that, this board should boot up to the standard XL self-test screen, because of course it doesn't have ROM built in. So let's do that and see what happens. Okay, we are coming up on the moment of truth, kids. As you can see, I have removed the 1200XL ROMs and replaced them with a ROM from an 800XL. I've installed it in U13, which is the lower of the two OS ROM sockets. I have also replaced the 1200XL memory management unit chip with one from an 800XL. We have power connection. We have video connection. Let's flip the switch and see what happens. Success! Straight to the Excel memory test as expected. So, that means I should be able to, eventually, solder 4 jumper wires to particular locations around the board to pick up signals, the 4 signals that the Ultimate 1 megabyte requires. I will mount the board to my 1200XL somewhere convenient where it does not interfere with my UAV video. I will pull the 800XL MMU and OS ROM chips that I have installed, and I will connect the jumper cables from the Ultimate 1 megabyte to the missing or the now vacated sockets, and hopefully I'll then have a working Ultimate 1 megabyte in my 1200XL. Thanks for watching. Bye.